Hello, everybody. Welcome to the stream. It is very early in the morning here, but uh, it is not very early in the morning where Max is. So thanks for joining us, Max.
Thanks for having me.
So we're going to talk about YIMBYism because Max wrote a book called Yes to the City, and it is about the Yes in My Backyard movement, which arose in response to the perhaps more widely known NIMBY or Not in My Backyard movement, which tries to block development and housing. And so I want to get into the details of how YIMBYism emerged, what its pros and cons are, what are maybe some challenges going forward, and perhaps also the issue of housing more broadly and where this fits into it. But I wanted to ask Max, I wanted to ask by starting. I wanted to start by asking you about your research more generally, because you've been researching urbanism for a while, right? So if you could just tell us a bit about like what you've been researching and how you ended up looking into the YIMBY movement from that beginning.
I was always really interested in cities and the cost of living, housing prices, and particularly some of the massive changes that happened in the past 25 years. I did a lot of research in Eastern Europe, where people had to deal with the restitution of property, private property that was seized. I did a lot of work on tourism, which has only become a sort of bigger deal in the past 10 years, and with the rise of Airbnb. And I also was really interested in issues of gentrification and the cost of housing. And the YIMBY movement really came to my attention because it was talked about very quickly in all the major American news sources as a real kind of game changer in how people were thinking about neighborhoods and how they were thinking about housing. And that's particularly in the American context. The YIMBY groups, they exist all around Europe and they exist in the US. But I definitely was really interested in this as a kind of real challenge to how Americans were thinking about private property, about the kind of sacredness of the single family home. And I got very interested in it.
So when you say as a challenge to private property and the sacredness of the single family home, could you explain that a bit more? Because that just really piqued my interest, that comment.
Well, so YIMBYs are they're a movement that want to change zoning laws so that people can build multifamily units on places that are zoned only for single family homes. And that's like 75% of most American cities when this movement started about 12 years ago. It's changing in some part due to their efforts. But really, the way that most American cities look is it's single family homes on a kind of quarter acre lot. And that has been changing quickly as land prices and housing prices have gone up astronomically. And so, they're not kind of Bolsheviks who want to get rid of private property, and they don't want to kind of challenge the idea of private ownership of homes, but they do want to change zoning laws. And that was seen as fairly radical in the United States. And for a UK audience, much less radical because people are used to these things like townhouses. But they advocate for townhouses and for apartments and for making denser housing that's more vertical.
I mean, it's interesting in the book. You make a comment to the effect that in America, the word cities is sometimes of a bit of a misnomer, right? Because these suburbs are so sprawling, and you obviously you have a kind of urban core, but most people just live pretty far away, right? And it's just it's not really a city. And I suppose that's what you're getting at with the title of the book, right? Like actually Americans embracing cities for the first time.
Yeah, it's, sometimes you don't even have the urban core. The kind of urban core that we think of as Chicago, is kind of gone. When you get west of the Mississippi, a lot of those housing morphologies are all just big sprawling neighborhoods connected by highways with shopping malls. And it's pretty hard to pinpoint, where the city core is. And so in some ways, we still have an imaginary of cities where they are the Chicagos and the Philadelphias and the New Yorks, but they're much more likely to be a place like Phoenix, Arizona, Las Vegas, Nevada, that are these big collections of sprawling neighborhoods. And they're not very environmentally friendly, and they're not very they don't take land use into much consideration, and that's starting to be a real problem.
As a European, as Americans would refer to me, it is astonishing to me that you would have to drive somewhere to get like milk in a lot of these places. I don't. Do you know the show Always Sunny in Philadelphia?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's that episode where as Dennis and Mac move to the suburbs of Philadelphia. I don't know if you know it, and they sort of end up with this sort of nightmarish lifestyle where Dennis has got like a really really long commute, and Mac's like stuck at home losing his mind, and there's the sort of annoying neighbor who's constantly saying hello to them and stuff. It just really reminds me of that. I mean, on a serious note, what are some of the problems with this type of housing, with this way of building cities?
There's huge problems. I mean, the first one is that people just shouldn't be driving everywhere. And I had this experience like what happens in the show about 20 years ago. I was in Denver, and my friend said, "We have no milk for the coffee." And I don't really want to go out because the nearest store is a 10-minute drive away. And then we have to drive back and get the coffee. And so people are living in places that are entirely dependent on cars. There's no way to bike, there's no way to walk. Oftentimes there's not sidewalks. So that's a major issue. You also have a really bad and non-efficient use of land. So, for city governments, they have to bring services out to these suburbs, and oftentimes they're paying for it. And that's very expensive. You have land running out, so you can't just expand indefinitely, as some people basically believed that you could in cities like Salt Lake City, Utah, or Phoenix, Arizona. And you also have the lost wages and lost care time that people are spending in their cars. So that's just to name a few of the problems, that people are really spending most of their life in their cars just to live in a single family home. And the kind of neighborhoods that they're creating are pretty dead. They're places that are just residential. Some of them are kind of wastelands at the edge of the city, and they're not places that we would think of as aesthetically pleasing or socially vibrant.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I hear all that. I suppose are there any benefits? I mean, why are Americans stuck with this type of city? Was there any reason to do it? Is there any benefit that can be spoken of?
There's a lot of arguments in urban studies about, how this happened. Is it sort of a kind of path dependency based on infrastructure and public spending? Or is it because Americans really culturally love a single family home, and they have this kind of frontier mentality of they don't want neighbors, they don't want someone living on top of them in an apartment building? Some of the benefits are that by having these huge sprawling cities, a lot of people were able to qualify for home ownership, largely white kind of middle class people. But many, many people are homeowners because they continuously built. And there's always the kind of maxim they have in the US is drive until you qualify, which is if there's the house you want in the center of the city and you can't afford it because you're not approved for the loan, then drive out farther and farther, and eventually you're going to qualify for a loan.
You know, the country I'm more familiar with, and we were talking about this just before the stream started, is Australia. And I feel like there's a bit of similarity there. Where my family live in Perth, it was always striking to me that when they wanted a new house, they'd just go and build it in the suburbs. There's this thing of just going out and building it. I guess that kind of similar to the frontier mentality in the USA.
Absolutely. And I'm joining you from Melbourne, Australia right now, and I've lived in Australia for 7 years. And a lot of it's just easier. The time and effort that it takes to coordinate with private builders and developers and to finance something that's denser and that requires more infrastructure, or buildings that are multi-story. It just takes a lot more time. And so if you live in a country with a lot of space, it's a lot easier to build with that kind of housing morphology. But eventually, gas prices go up. It gets very expensive. People don't like living in these neighborhoods. Some of these neighborhoods develop, unsavory reputations because they're too far from the city, or they're seen as kind of derelict. And so there's a lot of kind of problems that have been heaping up because of this kind of development, that I think now are really coming to fruition as people deal with a number of different issues.
Yeah, yeah. So let's talk about the YIMBY movement itself then, because that's a good point to start. So I actually, being quite an online person, I actually thought that it emerged online, but it didn't. It emerged in San Francisco, right, as an actual
Yeah.
movement of people in the real world. So could you talk us through how that happened?
Yeah, so it came about in San Francisco, which, before the pandemic, the average apartment there cost 3,500 US dollars a month to rent. So it was the most expensive city to live in, just really astronomical prices. And I'm not talking about a fancy apartment, that's the
Mm.
average. So you could live in a really beat up place for that tremendous sum of
In
money.
the most expensive city in the USA or in the world?
In the United States. In the world, it's number three or four,
Right,
depending on Hong Kong, Sydney.
right, yeah.
There's a few ways to measure it. You can also measure it based on people's income. And so, you know, San Francisco is also not a very large city. So it has not traditionally approved new development. And a lot of it is kind of older people who own homes, who like the kind of smaller city. They like the city that's only one or two stories tall. And they basically told people that they didn't want new developments. And even if those developments were pretty modest, so a block of 6 apartments, some townhouses, they thought that it would destroy the neighborhood character. And most of the meetings that zoning boards and city councils held in San Francisco were filled with people saying no to developers and no to architects and making them go back to the table in a very expensive process of redrawing plans and downsizing the developments they wanted to build. And so this group, the YIMBY group, the first ones that emerged, I should say there's quite a few of them. There's dozens of them in different cities, and they're kind of loosely confederated. They started showing up to these meetings and saying, look, we're young professionals. We went to university, we went to graduate school, we earn over 100,000 US dollars a year, and we cannot afford to rent anything in this city. So how are we supposed to live here if you won't build new housing? And San Francisco has a huge problem with working class people living there. It has a huge problem with people who are super commuters, who are taking 3 hours each way on a train or a bus to get to their work. And so this movement really started with a kind of frustration of middle class people, really oftentimes very securely middle class people who said, look, we need a chance in this city. And we're not going to get that chance unless you allow for some new development.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned two aspects of this debate, which I think are really interesting, each in their own right, and maybe together. One is class, the other is age, right? So let's talk about class first, because clearly you and I both agree with the YIMBYs about suburbia, but is there a sense in which they are six-figure income young professionals who are, coming into cities and advocating the type of housing that might displace poorer existing residents?
Yeah. So basically, there is the jeopardy of gentrification happening when these developments are built. But what their argument is, and I think it holds a lot of water,
Mm-hmm.
is that a lot of where they wanted to build were in places that were already gentrified or places that were already quite fancy, where the houses cost $2 million, and they weren't going to displace people by subdividing a few lots or by gathering a parcel of a few houses. And their presence wasn't going to be that onerous. There's a few more technical debates about certain neighborhoods they're operating in, but they basically would say that solving the housing crisis needs to happen on various different levels. It needs to happen for public
Yeah.
housing. It needs to happen for private accommodation, and so you can't just say, and they would argue for a long time, people just said we need to look after the most vulnerable. We need to build public housing, and that didn't happen on two counts. On one, massive gentrification did happen, and people had to move farther and farther from the city. And number two, public housing was not built. So they said, let's try something different and let's try to build more of all forms of housing. And if we can build more market rate housing, perhaps that will also lessen the gentrification pressures on neighborhoods that are going through rapid economic and social change.
Yeah, yeah. Do you think that happens? Do you think it does lessen these pressures in practice? I know you talk about one or two studies in the book, and I've seen more emerge. I mean, there was that upzoning that happened in New Zealand, right,
Yeah.
recently, and people are sort of hailing that as quite a big success. So do you think their arguments hold?
New Zealand has been a success. I think that their arguments hold to the extent that increasing the housing stock will eventually lower prices.
Hmm.
Unfortunately, that process is really slow.
Right.
It's not a matter of years, but more a matter of decades. So these kind of measures, like it's not, there's a kind of term that's thrown at YIMBYs pretty often, which is supply fundamentalism, which is that all they care about is housing supply, and they think that will solve all the problems. I think that's a pretty unfair moniker. I think most of them know that supply is just one element, and that there needs to be other changes made. Part of this is a kind of cost of living crisis, which is that wages are not high enough. Another part of it is that there's been massive divestment in social housing. And so there's a number of things that have to happen to make housing prices go down. But yeah, supply is absolutely one of them.
It's tricky, isn't it? Because I mean, a lot of the studies will find that the supply of housing goes up. And the way a lot of these studies are designed is to try and get some kind of causal effect, which will usually be comparative, as in compared to a control group, And so house prices might go down relative to the control group, but it's quite rare and politically very undesirable, I think, for house prices just to go down. As in, you
Yeah.
don't see that house prices in the Anglo world, and I don't know, maybe across the world, we've bought into this idea that house prices always go up. So just when you were saying, oh, it's a matter of decades, I think what that is house prices basically have to go up slowly enough for a long
Yeah.
period of time for everybody to catch up, right? Because if they start going down, everybody panics, right? I mean, we had that. They went down for a bit last year in the UK, and everyone complains about the housing crisis. But then when they start going down, everyone's like, no, house prices are going down, and it's like, it's this really tricky bind I think we find ourselves in. I mean, I'm not asking you to solve it, but I just thought it was worth
No, I
mentioning.
mean, people are really afraid of that. And because politicians are extremely attuned to a kind of upper middle class constituency,
Mm.
which is really based on people who are homeowners or even have second homes, they're really attuned to housing as an investment. And also, a lot of countries, the UK, the US, and Australia in particular, have really encouraged people to be over leveraged when it comes to
Yeah.
their mortgages. They've really allowed people to borrow as much as possible. And that's not to say that there's going to be a 2008 and there's going to be all these subprime mortgages they're going to get called on. It's not that. It's that people have really put too much of their equity into their homes, and you also see some real problems with the tax incentives that are given for whether this is in the United States where you're not charged tax on your mortgage, or in Australia where you have negative gearing and you can write off losses on one property on your primary residence. There's a lot of middle class subsidies for housing, and that's a real problem. So
Mm.
that gives money to some of the people who need it the least, and also encourages them to get really, really invested in property and see it more as a financial mechanism that's going to allow for things like retirement or for a larger portfolio rather than use value, which people I think would like to agree is a kind of the most socially purposeful use.
Yeah, I mean, there's something that struck me when looking into this is that in the UK certainly, and I think this probably applies in the US and in Australia, right? It's like our houses are kind of like a pension as well, right? So that's what we use, that's what we invest in. And it just, I think there's an underlying issue here, isn't there, really, which is the public sector, right? And the public sector arises with pensions, but more directly with housing, right? So, I mean, you said public housing isn't forthcoming in the United States. which I completely accept as a pragmatic argument. But I mean, to what extent does the YIMBY movement, in practice, if not in principle, represent a kind of giving up on public housing and giving up on the public sector?
Yeah, I mean, I think that they would argue that they're not giving up, but they're letting that form of activism be taken up by different people. So
Mm-hmm.
a lot of them would say, look, we're middle class professionals, we're well educated, and we want to fight for kind of middle class housing. And there's plenty of people who live in marginalized neighborhoods with low socioeconomic uh, outcomes. And we're going to let them focus on public housing, people who are existing residents of public housing. And they would say those things can comfortably coexist. I should note that a lot of anti-gentrification activists say, hell no, they cannot comfortably coexist because at the end of the day, you're going to want to build stuff in neighborhoods that are gentrifying because it's just easier to build there and there's space, and you're going to change the cultural feel and the demographic makeup of those neighborhoods. So yeah, I think that's a major issue. I should say that in the United States, when we talk about things like housing, as people are obsessed with it, it's become their pension. I mean, part of that is also because we have a really unaffordable society. We don't have universal health care like the UK. We don't have subsidized. I mean, I should say in the UK, no one wants to say that the education is subsidized because it's been raised so much in the past couple of years, but it is still subsidized more higher education than the United States. So people have these rising house values, and it makes up for a lot of kind of pulling away of the social safety net in other aspects of their lives.
Yeah, yeah. I think I mean there's this much deeper issue, isn't there? And just the cost of living in the US and having to pay for all of what are often public services elsewhere, just puts a lot of pressure on people, right?
Yeah.
So I want to talk a little bit. I'm trying. I'm kind of goading you into being into criticizing Yimbys, but I just there's something that you said in the book. There were two things, and you mentioned one of them earlier. Two things they have a little bit of trouble with, or tend to avoid, right? So one is Airbnb, and the other one is like corporate. Is sort of corporate investment in the housing sector, right? Big investment firms that own multiple houses, right? So, do you think that addressing these is really a big part of addressing the housing crisis?
Airbnb in certain cities, yeah, it has had a major effect. My personal opinion is that Airbnb, the genie is sort of out of the bottle, and that
Hmm.
the way to solve this problem is taxing people who very, very high municipal taxes on people who are renting apartments. Um, there could be a ban on it. I'm not sure how it would function logistically. I think that the YIMBY movement doesn't really talk about it that much because their main focus is people's primary residence. And I think they would say, look, we want to get people into homes. We want to get them, we want affordable rents, and we want people to have the opportunity to become homeowners. Um, and then there's also a big split in the YIMBY movement. There's some people who see YIMBYism as just about housing affordability, and they're kind of applying some really basic urban planning ideas. The idea of having denser cities, a better public transportation, more apartment buildings, more green spaces. So in that sense, they're kind of like urban planning dorks who just want to employ what stuff that architects have been talking about for 30 years. On the other hand, there's some people who are sort of their their problem with zoning and with single family housing is a larger problem with rules in general. Their issue is that they come from a more kind of libertarian ethos, and they want to kind of chip away at all zoning and all planning laws because their idea is like you get to do what you want to do with your land. And so in that sense, they would be people who would say, okay, well, it's my land, it's my place. If I want to Airbnb it, then that's my right. But I would say those people are actually in the minority within the YIMBY movement, and they are not the loudest voices. Although some of them have been loud and they've been very much criticized. And I think at times they can also serve as a sort of scapegoat for YIMBYism because they're kind of like this character from Central Casting, the kind of like Texan free marketeer who,
Mm.
wants to be left alone on their land.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's an interesting question, right? 'Cause it raises this almost philosophical question of like what it means to buy a house. Like, what do you buy when you buy a house? Because I think most people agree, right? Say you bought a house out in the country, and then one day you woke up and found out that there was a coal plant being constructed next to it. I think most people would agree that that's unreasonable. It's no longer the house you bought, remote, unpolluted. Once there's a coal power plant next door, but at the same time, I mean, I remember when my mum moved into a new neighborhood that wasn't really that friendly, and she painted her front door pink, which the neighbours didn't like, and they came and knocked on the door and said they thought it was inappropriate for her to paint the front door pink. And she responded by painting the entire house pink. But I mean that's the type of NIMBYism, right? That we don't like, right? So I mean, how do you see this issue of zoning, and how do you draw the line between these two?
Your mom sounds awesome. I feel like she'd be a great sort of housing protester. I think that a lot of people would say that zoning started for some very practical reasons. They were environmental in nature and about public health and safety. And then some people would say that in certain places it's gotten a bit out of control. And there are places in the U.S. where there are local codes about, you can do this and that with your house. You have to have this color. Some of it's in places that are historic districts.
Mm.
And so there is a kind of mandate to keep the places as they looked and to kind of respect the historical legacy. But other places are just, that's their aesthetic choice. And they came together as a local council and passed that rule. And so they can come to your mom with the order that says, I'm
Mm.
sorry, these are the prohibited colors, and pink and purple are on the list. So, paint your house back to white. So I think that there's a frustration with that. Um, but I think that most people are mostly coming at it from a more practical point, which is that it's not really about nitpicky neighbors. It's much more about a lack of planning in general. And so a lot of the people, they actually want more planning. They want more planning, and they want more organization of cities. They want better thought going into the built environment, where it's not just like someone comes and builds a kind of like 1950s suburb where there's a couple thousand houses that all look the same. They want better quality construction, and they want construction that is more interesting and also easier to get around.
I mean, yeah, I think it's this is one of the many problems with libertarianism, right? But it's always planning. It's kind of just planning for whom, and is it all above board, and does it serve the local community and a general social purpose, right? So I think one of the things about certain brands of NIMBYism is that you get this arbitrary power of just a few nearby neighbors, and you're not bringing in necessarily town planning experts. You're not bringing in communities who can't afford to live there, or prospective communities, right? It just becomes a sort of a private tyranny.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in the US, it's also
Whoops.
particularly pronounced, which is that a lot of this responds, I think that a lot of it responds to the history of racism in housing, where, there were places that had, practices amongst real estate agents who would not sell Black families, Jewish families, sometimes even Catholic families. In certain areas up until the 1950s and 60s. So in some ways, I think there's a real connotation of racism when people talk about NIMBYism or some forms of NIMBYism. There's also a level of classism. Some of the people said that, we don't want, when they were talking to city councils and zoning boards, they would say, we don't want apartment people in our neighborhood. And so they would say, it's going to be too many cars and too many people in the public school, and there's going to be apartment people. And the real question is, well, what do you mean by apartment people? And I think that it's not so subtly that people don't want poor people. They don't want people who can't afford to buy a house. Um, and part of the kind of heavy lift, and this might sound crazy in the UK, is that the heavy lift that some YIMBY groups have to do is convincing people that they can be middle class and have kids and live in an apartment and it will be okay and that they'll have a nice quality of life. And part of, we don't have a great housing stock in the US of apartments in some cities. So there's not a lot of examples of what it looks like to live in a nice apartment building. But also, some people really do have an issue with that life. And so, trying to sell people on it is a major endeavor in a number of cities.
It's interesting because despite looking into this and understanding the racist history and the arbitrariness of the single family suburban home, when I think about like growing up and having a family, it's that image is still in my head, right? It's like I would be living out in the suburbs. I wouldn't be living in the city. I think it's a very powerful narrative, and I expect it's even more powerful in the USA, to be honest. And there's just no denying that there are class lines and there are race lines for this. I mean, there's a comedian on YouTube, I forget his name, Finley Christie, where he goes around asking people in London, do your grandparents have a house in the country? And almost every white person says yes, of course I go there. I go there every summer. And then almost every black person is like, no, they live like just down the road from me. You know what I mean? In an apartment. So yeah, I mean, it's a really powerful narrative that is just very racist and classist at its heart.
I should say, the US, it's not just about living the good life and, I want to go like play croquet and drink Pimm's in the country. It's also people have a real imaginary of having a defendable space, having private property. It's like they want to have their backyard, their front yard. I mean, it's a reason. There's a reason why stand your ground laws are American, which is that deep in the American psyche is this idea that you need a defendable space and that you're going to be, if you have to share with other people or be too close to them, that's really dangerous. And I think that's really eroded our sense of trust. And there's a real problem where people are from neighborhoods where they don't have many social interactions, they don't have many public places, and they've just individualized everything down to the family unit. And you can see that level of distrust playing out in American politics in really pernicious ways.
It's just get the hell off my lawn, isn't it? Basically, it's like that.
Absolutely.
That whole thing.
Yeah, there's so many places you go. I think you have to visit the U.S. and people are aghast and they see the signs of don't come on my lawn, I'm armed.
It's
they
just
think it's a joke, but it's not.
Americans, like, I know most of my listeners and audience, and you think this is absurd, but to communicate how absurd it is to almost every other country in the world. I find it impossible to communicate it. Like the idea that you would be, you would have like a gun to deter intruders from your home that's like out somewhere, and that's like your castle. It's just so weird, like and really unique to the US. I don't know. I don't know why I'm laughing. Maybe it's like laugh or you'll cry kind of thing.
Yeah, and there's a lot of paranoia. I mean, look at all the kind of movies for the Hollywood produces about home invasions and having to arm yourself to the teeth. Like it's a big part of the American culture to have a house. But at the same time, you can have the nicest house in the world, and it can be really isolating living that way. If you're living in the state of fear, if you're living, you can have a beautiful 6-bedroom house, but if you think everyone's going to attack you and you have to, patrol the perimeter of your yard, that's not a great way to live.
No. It's incredible. I mean, I don't know how to address it. It's so deep seated. I mean, let's talk about cars a little bit, because I think you mentioned them earlier, and I wanted to talk about them a bit more. And it's part of this whole vision, isn't it? Because there's the whole I don't know if you know the fuck cars movement, which is kind of adjacent to the YIMBY movement, right? And when you were describing the problems with American suburbs, you were really focused on cars and the commute, and so and at the same time, it seems that these same people who have this castle mentality, the car is a massive part of their view of freedom and being out on the road and stuff. So, I mean, to what extent do you think this is a kind of fuck cars thing, the YIMBY movement?
Yeah, I do think that for sure it's a fuck cars part of a wider movement. There's the war on cars, and there's all these things happening. People look at the kind of environmental costs, but also the economic costs of having to drive absolutely everywhere and having no choice. Having to pay for parking, find parking. It's a huge drain, and it really, having lived most of my life in New York, I really love not having to drive. And I whenever I go somewhere else, you have to think about, well, I can't drink at dinner. I can't, like, I have to plan on parking. I have to do all these things. And so it is a really, it is a big problem, and also, trying to plan for parking, trying to make building codes, that have parking incorporated is very difficult. And so, for a long time, when they were building apartments in most American cities, they had a minimum car number per apartment, and it usually wasn't two. It was or sorry, it usually wasn't one. It was more like two. So that involves a lot of extra costs for developers. So even if you get people to live in an apartment, even if you convince them to live a little bit more of a contained life, a little bit more of a pedestrian life where they have a car, but they don't use it all the time, the building codes would actually mandate you to put in structured parking. And that increases the cost of development exponentially when you have to build some sort of structure, or lease out parking.
You've got the houses that take up too much space for not enough people, and then you've got the cars that that sort of almost double that, right? And you have to devote loads of space in cities to car parks or parking spaces, and that means wider roads, right? And then you've just got this horrible cumulative effect where you're not fitting that many people, in each area of land, plus pollution, and all the problems that leads to, plus the fact that, like, I don't know. I mean, maybe this is just personal preference. I understand the idea of, like, going on a big drive on one of the big American roads. I think that would be pretty cool. But in practice, that's not what driving a car's like. Especially in a city, you're just stuck, and it's horrible, and it takes ages, and you get road rage, and, like, it doesn't get you to where you want to be. And famously, I mean, going back to Always Sunny, right? Famously, the commute is something that almost everybody hates. So I don't understand. There must be some kind of cognitive dissonance here, because I'm sure that the same castle mentality people would acknowledge that they probably hate their commute and being stuck on the freeway, but somehow it's a part of their freedom.
Well, everyone, this is something that we've all kind of growing up in cultures that fetishize cars. We have the kind of, like, commercial version of driving through New Zealand in, like, a beautiful mountain road, and it's just you, whereas really you're just breathing exhaust, on your commute. And similarly, we've also sold people massive SUVs that are now the norm, as if they're going to go off-roading every weekend. And really, they're just bringing them to the supermarket. And it's a kind of, race to us all driving tanks in some ways. And this is something I've thought about a lot, especially here in Australia, where you see people driving bigger and bigger cars, which is that if other people do it, you don't want to be the one poor schmuck who's driving a little VW Bug and everyone's driving some kind of massive Hummer or Range Rover alongside you, because you're going to feel really vulnerable, and you will be very vulnerable if you get into a wreck. So yeah, that's a big problem when it comes to planning. We have really planned our cities around cars. And it's really hard to make that change. And that's a change, people feel really vehemently about. Here in Melbourne, also in New York, there's been massive anger at trying to put in just a couple bike lanes. And, you look at all the space dedicated to cars, whether it's parking them or driving them, or, auto body shops, car dealerships, and there's a little tiny bike lane that's like a meter wide, and people are absolutely apoplectic about it. And there's something about that really, really ticks people off. Part of it has to be class, I think. I mean, more and more, and this is something YIMBYs really encounter, is that they're arguing for people who want to live in the city. They want to live in apartments. And some people won't have the opportunity because it's just going to be too expensive. And they mix a kind of economic um, indignation because they have to live farther out of the city, and they can't access a lot of the kind of things the center city has to offer, with the kind of cultural animus as well, which is they're angry at the people who bike, they're angry at the people who can walk to the store, and the two things are kind of fused together, and it's hard to disentangle them because people are pissed that they have to live a 2 hour commute away, and they do resent people who are urbanites, and I see that. I don't know how to change that mindset. I don't think.
I mean, I don't know if you've been to Copenhagen or Amsterdam are the two cities that spring to mind, which are heavily built around bikes. And I mean, they're different. Copenhagen still has quite big roads and there are cars. They just aren't that many, and they're a very, very big and useful, for want of a better word, cycle lanes, right? They're everywhere, right? They're easy to use. Barcelona's kind of similar, actually. Amsterdam's more, it's just cycling. There's just cyclists everywhere. They ride past you, and they ride sort of among the pedestrians, right? But I think in both of those cities, Copenhagen and Amsterdam, there are more bicycles than there are people, right? And you can't go there and be like, oh well, this is a horrible place. Nobody's free here. Nobody can get around. You know what I mean? They're really, really nice places. People are just much happier in that kind of like pedestrian centric, cycle centric, and multi story apartment environment, right? With commercial and residential buildings, and all other types of buildings together. It's just an unambiguously better place to be compared to, would you use the example of Phoenix, Arizona, which is just sort of a urban
Yeah.
sprawl.
Yeah, people, I think there's a problem, which is that a lot of people, they don't want to, they're wary of public spaces, whether it's for crime or they're just like, the last time they were on the tram, some dude was like playing their like TikTok at the top volume and on their phone, and it really pissed them off. They want to kind of control their whole
That is
space.
annoying, but yeah.
I love the Amsterdam example because they've done such a good job at not just at the inner city, but the entire city and all of the Netherlands, like linking it up with public transportation, long distance bike routes for all different kinds of neighborhoods. And people always say, oh, how do they do it? And I say, well, look, if you've ever been there, unless you're there in like August, it's like cold and windy and there's a North Sea breeze. And if they can do it, then here in Australia, like, what are you complaining about?
Mm.
It gets to like, it's barely cold here. And the other thing is that, when people say, oh, but that's in their DNA, they've always been doing it. That's not so. If you look at Amsterdam in the 70s, it was filled with cars, and there was a big campaign called Stop the Child Death or something, Stop Child Murder, because a lot of kids were getting hit by cars, and they pulled the cars off the streets, and they got rid of a lot of the highways, and they put them onto ring roads outside of the city. And so it solved traffic problems as well, which is that if you want to drive, you can go along the ring road
Mm.
and get places faster. But most of the city will be reserved for pedestrians and bicyclists.
Mm. Imagine having a problem where people are being killed and then passing laws and devoting resources to solving it. It's something
As an
that
American, I
think.
cannot imagine that.
No,
That's beyond my, yeah.
in the UK, we might pass a law, but we won't give it any resources. But so I guess it's slightly better over here, but not really. So while we're on the country of Europe, there's somebody in chat who's very keen for us to discuss Vienna, because they have one of the more successful approaches to housing, right, in the world, I think. And so could you talk us through that a bit?
Yeah, so Vienna has a really extraordinary public housing program. It started with the socialist governments in the interwar period, in the kind of Red Vienna period, and they've never stopped investing in social housing. And so they've done a really great job keeping that as an avenue for all different like class levels. So they've done a lot with refugees and new migrants, but they've also provided some social housing for people who are quite middle class. And it's a great model, and it shows you that just building is not going to be a panacea. for these kind of issues. Yeah, I think Vienna is a really excellent example. There's been some problems with people buying or renting houses off the kind of traditional marketplace, but it also shows you a lot about what you can do when a city is determined to have some ideas about inclusionary zoning, some ideas about rent control that allow for a kind of middle class city. So, in not just Vienna, but a lot of German cities, there's been a really concerted attempt to allow people to be lifelong renters as well. So it's
Yeah.
not that advantageous to buy, and there's some real tax and other issues that make it so long-term renting is prioritized, and that's a really interesting policy experiment and something that I think the UK and the US are really loath to try, despite the fact that it's had uh, some great results.
I mean, Germany's a really good example of what we were talking about earlier, right? Because, like you said, it's like the rental contracts are virtually permanent. There's rent control, so they can't go up too fast, and the net result is that the average German renter is probably about as secure as the average UK or US homeowner, with
Yeah.
a mortgage, I should say. Right? It's like, you're paying money in every month, and it's pretty difficult to get you out, especially as long as you keep paying. And again, this it comes back to this idea of ownership, right? And I think this is something which does emerge from your book, right? Because while the YIMBY movement is welcome for all the reasons we've spoken about, um, you seem quite keen on challenging these notions of private ownership of housing, right, and moving towards maybe public housing, right, which has been successful in a number of countries. You've got Vienna, you've got Germany, you've got a lot of the Scandinavian countries. In Finland, they just give people houses if they're unhoused, which is a really successful approach. Who would have thought? But there's other initiatives, right? And I wanted to ask you about things which, from what I remember, and correct me if I'm wrong, you only kind of mentioned these in passing, but there's community efforts, right? Community land trusts, housing cooperatives. I think they've been quite successful in Switzerland. Housing co-ops also, and sort of land back movements are successful in poorer countries as well, right? So
Yeah.
in Brazil, there's these groups which claim land, and there is a provision in the Brazilian constitution that says property has to serve a social purpose or something to that effect. So they use that to claim vacant land, right? And they can then build housing and build communities there. So, I mean, to what extent do you think really addressing this housing problem might mean moving away from current notions of private ownership of housing and towards perhaps more communal ones, whether public or
I think
ground
that's a
up?
big part of it. I mean, I think having viable social housing is more and more important for a variety of reasons. One is the kind of long-term inequality we see in places like the UK and the US. Another issue is that a lot of places are going to have major problems with climate change, and there's going to be a lot of housing that's going to have to be demolished because it's too close to the sea
Mm,
or it's in floodplains. And so, the state might be in the business of supplying housing for a variety of reasons, and not just poverty. I think that there's also some more iterative things that can be done. So right now, we've done everything possible to emphasize that people should put their money into housing, and housing should be a kind of something that's invested in as a financial vehicle. And we've structured our tax systems in the US and Australia particularly, and the UK to some extent, to really encourage ownership, unlike continental Europe, where ownership has been de-emphasized by pretty easy policy mechanisms like taxes. And some people have trouble getting their head around social housing conceptually, and they think, well, I would never want to live in that kind of housing. And they can barely accept to have social housing in a mixed income neighborhood. But it doesn't have to be those kind of changes. It can be other kinds of changes in tandem as well. So it can be things that are really simple, like lifelong renting. And
mm,
people would say, oh my God, but what will I do if I don't have my money in my house? And the answer is Well, you'll be a lot more mobile if you want to move to a different city for a different job opportunity. So that's one good thing. And you can also put your money into an index fund or any other kind of asset.
Hmm.
There's no reason why we should be so tied to housing. And if you look at it as an investment vehicle, historically in the long term, it hasn't been the best investment. It's been more use value. It's only in the past 25 years that it's been everyone thinks that it's this amazing thing that's so much better than any other kind of investment.
Yeah, and I mean, you kind of alluded to the crisis, the 2008 financial crisis earlier, right? But this housing bubbles are a thing, right? And it's one part of investing so much into housing, both economically but also politically, right? It's an asset. It can be very unstable, depending on the banking system. Banks can do some very funky things with those mortgages, right? And yeah, it just doesn't seem like a sustainable basis for a social support system, and all the other questions we ask of it.
And talk about the 2008 bubble. It's really a case of construction companies and banks and developers building housing for the sake of increasing their portfolio rather than housing that was
Yeah.
good housing or housing that was really needed in the areas where they built it. And you can see the same thing happening in China right now, which is that places, certain financial systems get absolutely obsessed with the property sector and they overinvest in housing that's unneeded by virtue of either its quality or where it's located. And that was, a lot of the biggest shocks that you saw in 2008 were in the market of places that were just building housing to build it and keep selling it and selling and selling it. But it was in, the far reaches of suburban Las Vegas. It was in these kind of ghost towns in central Spain, or in housing estates far outside of Dublin. So that sort of shows the tragedy of financialization of housing, rather than
Mm.
seeing who's using it, where is it needed, what jobs is it serving, and how can we make a kind of neighborhood, rather than letting people just profit from continually building it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's private ownership is one thing. Like, as you implied, I can kind of make my peace with like private landlords who were subject to heavy regulations, like in Germany, right, where it just is a source of stable housing for a lot of people. But I think the credit system and the financialization is actually perhaps more of a villain in this. And it just, I think, I mean, Josh Ryan Collins has spoken about this. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him, but his the credit cycle in housing, and where you just lend, and then the house prices go up, and then you have to lend more to people to buy them, and that's part of, I think, what's driving this, right? And I mean, I don't know. To return to theme, is this something that YIMBYs talk about, or is it something they maybe don't emphasize enough?
I don't think they emphasize it enough. I think that a lot of where they're based are sort of large, successful cities where they're selling properties to individual owners for quite high prices. And so there's a kind of face that goes with the apartment. Unfortunately, what you see is a huge buy up of single family housing, residential units, and subprime units by massive landlords, and usually who administer it quite badly, and try to get as much profit as possible for their shareholders. So that kind of prop tech world is quite scary, and it's gotten to the extent where, like, using some of these technological tools, you really can just have a kind of algorithm that sorts out this is a good price to pay for this house, and we're going to add it to our portfolio of thousands of homes. And I don't think that's going to serve renters or very well.
No, no, absolutely not. And well, I mean, it goes back to, there's private ownership and there's private ownership, right? There's your sort of retired uh, landlord who maybe has a history of working in the construction sector. My dad springs to mind, actually, right? And it's like, and then there's like these massive sort of multinational companies that are
Yeah.
just sort of building for their portfolios, as you said.
And they're growing. That's the scary thing, which is the
Yeah,
the latter is growing, the farmer is not.
yeah. Absolutely. I wanted to ask you about something which we have only really touched on, and maybe it hasn't been mentioned at all. But the green belt, because so the green belt is, for anyone who isn't familiar with it, is just like a designated ring around a city that you're not really allowed to build on. Certainly not very much, and maybe nothing at all. And the idea is that it's green, right? It's countryside. It stops the city from expanding into the countryside, and blighting the landscape, and destroying the environment and all the rest of it. And now the green belt is something that I always find that the zoning debate is very complex, and it kind of you have to drop a lot of your preconceptions, because when I hear greenbelt, my inner environmentalist says, "Yeah, that's a good idea, right? You don't want the city to go on forever. You need the countryside, so why not?" But I've not met anyone who works in urban planning or adjacent to urban planning who thinks that the greenbelt is a good idea. And you use a really interesting example in the book, which was just so fascinating to me, which is the town of Boulder, Colorado, right? Which just seems to have had an absolute nightmare with NIMBYism and the greenbelt.
Yeah, Boulder is a town. It's about 100,000 people, and it's been about 100,000 people for 40 or 50 years. It's a university town, really highly educated, in this beautiful place right next to the Rocky Mountains, outside of Denver, which is the largest city in Colorado. It's about an hour away. And it made a green belt in the 1960s and 70s. And that green belt was to limit suburban sprawl. And it was a great idea. And it follows in this very honorable British tradition started by Ebenezer Howard in the early 20th century to make these kind of containers and make sure that cities didn't sprawl. And unfortunately, what happened is there wasn't really the power to administer this on a regional level. And so the cities just jumped over the greenbelt and created new cities outside. And so Boulder has the most bike paths of any city in the United States. It has amazing hiking, and it has this green belt that has really bolstered property prices to huge levels. It's about the average house price there is about $1 million now. And so it's completely unaffordable for any kind of middle class or working class people who live there. And they live outside. They live like, a 40-minute, hour-long commute in one of these satellite cities on the other side of the greenbelt. So the kind of sad irony is that it's a very environmentalist town, but everyone's driving back and forth with no real public transportation to the other side of the greenbelt.
Driving across the greenbelt, right?
Yeah, driving across the
Yeah.
greenbelt both ways. It's provided a lot of good things in terms of access to community agriculture, because some of it's leased to agricultural land. There's tons of hiking, and there's some other things. And you could say the same about cities like Adelaide in Australia that has a green belt, or London, or Welwyn Garden City. There's a lot of places that have these green belts, and they have really nice parks.
Mm.
But the issue is that they're not actually using them as they were intended to kind of control sprawl. And a lot of them also have sort of derelict areas where, particularly London, where nothing's really going
Yeah.
on there. And there's a question about, well, why couldn't you build there to relieve the housing crisis? And that's become a really tricky issue in London, in Toronto, and a number of different places. And I think part of it is sort of letting go of this idea of like that it still serves its original function. And Boulder also has the real problem, which a lot of YIMBY people talk about, which is they don't really want to see themselves as a city. So there's a lot of places that say we're just a small town, we're just a kind of cute little community, we're not a city, and we get to stay as we are in perpetuity. And that just can't be the case. Places change. They need to let new people in, and they can't just stay the same. And oftentimes, that kind of inaction creates really negative outcomes, because by not planning and by saying no to everything, and not sort of imagining a future, people just let things happen. And that causes a real chaotic form of development.
Exactly. I mean, this is what we said earlier, right? It's like no, planning is still planning. You're just planning badly. And if you
Exactly.
just like leave it to the wind, because people are going to move around, right? I mean, it strikes me as related to the immigration debate, although we don't have to go into that. But like, people are going to move around a country, right? People are going to move into a country. You can't stop them from setting up somehow, from building somehow, as long as you want a sort of remotely free country, unless you've got a complete dictatorship, right, or a totalitarian state even, right. So you have to make sure it's above board, and you can protect the environment that way, right? You can allocate green spaces. I mean, the green belt in London is a massive problem, like you just said, right? And there's a guy called Mark Pennington who wrote his PhD thesis on this. Do you know that? You're nodding
I have his
profusely.
book.
Yeah,
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 yeah.
it's really good. It's really good. On yeah, and I think that's our main problem in the UK. Actually, we have the suburban thing, but I feel like, we've got, there's always a shop nearby, right? And there's sort of multiple uses almost anywhere you go. But I think our big problem in the UK is like the green belt, and it really inhibits things. But you can have green spaces. The interior of London has green spaces. The British countryside is still massive, and I'm pretty sure the statistic or the fact is that the green belt has actually been expanding over the past couple of decades in the UK, while the housing crisis has been getting worse. And I'm like, okay, well, in terms of my balance between countryside and city, I think we're on the wrong side. We've got too much countryside, which isn't a sentence I like to say out loud, but it's like, it's just an unworkable idea, the green belt. And the clue's in the name, right? You're strangling the city.
It was meant to be an emerald necklace that protected the city from sprawl, but it hasn't worked out that way. And unfortunately, you really have to consider what use value people are getting out of the green spaces and making sure that it's really good. And what's happened in London and other cities is when you limit growth in that kind of arbitrary way, what's happened is people just go past the green belt and they build what they want,
Yeah.
and they don't have as efficient land use as they should. And that's happened in most cities. And I think that the kind of tide will start to change on that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I do. I do hope so. So I think there's. Well, actually, no. Let me ask you this: Have you? So I wonder to what extent this is related to kind of high modernism. So I keep asking you if you're familiar with things, but do you know Seeing Like a State, the book by
Yeah,
James C.
James Scott.
Scott?
Yeah,
Because he talks about this, and when I think about the greenbelt, I think about the kind of garden city, and it's a very imagined vision, isn't it? Or there's the city in the middle where we say it's going to be, and then all around it there's this kind of this protective greenbelt, or emerald necklace as you called it, right? And I mean, do you think the almost everything we've talked about, right, and the issues with planning, do you think this is partly a product of this kind of high modernist planning that's very top down, and contrast with Jane Jacobs, for instance, who you reference in the book, who was very much a bottom up vision of how the city should work? I appreciate that's a very big question.
no, yeah, I think that the kind of like loose organization that Jane Jacobs proposes, where you just let things function organically. There are sort of little bits of libertarian thinking
Mm.
within Jane Jacobs. I know it's a heretical thing to say for someone who loves urban planning, but I think, and this is also sort of like James Scott's anarchism, which is like let things happen more naturally. I think that it's been the sort of wrong kinds of interventions in American cities. A lot of it's been interventions that sort of maximize profit, and try, let people build as much as possible without large scale public outlays of funding. I think that, when you look at a lot of things that come from high modernism, yeah, there's the overreach, there's the kind of Robert Moses people who are plowing highways through the Bronx, and there's the massive, ugly, kind of brutalist buildings that destroyed a lot of old historic stuff. But I also think that there is an increased role for the state to actually really take planning seriously, to have a kind of environmental conscious when it comes to building. So I think the sins of high modernism are overstated, actually, and I think that
Mm.
a lot of people now would like more state investment. And I think, you know, the reaction to the massive amount of changes that happened in the 60s and 70s, I think was often like a kind of hands-off approach. And now I think that people are asking for some forms of enforcement. They just want a different sort of priority. They don't want it to be drivers and suburban homeowners. They want it to be cities and pedestrianism and public transportation.
That's heresy on this channel to question anything James C. Scott has said. But no, I mean, no, I mean, I don't want to repeat some kind of platitude, but like, I guess, obviously, good planning is good, right? But I suppose the question is whether your planning is so restrictive, and whether it only makes sense. This is the thing I was getting at with the greenbelt, right? It makes sense when you draw it as a nice picture in some architect's office, you know, really far away from where it's actually going to be built. But the planning has to make sense to the people who actually live there as well, all right, and bring them in and pay attention to the landscape and things like that, right? So it's just, I think a lot of the problems with high modernism were this very superficial aesthetic beauty, which didn't account for the actual reality of life and of buildings, right? And I certainly wouldn't say that precludes planning. I mean, I'm not a libertarian, right? So and again, it comes back to plan right, or you'll get a terrible outcome. But I just think that some of the plans that have been put in place have just been way too top down in the past.
Yeah, no, and you get a kind of paternalism of it as well, which is, you know, you look at Brasilia and there's like no
Mm,
place for any kind of small business because everything's like, here's the cafeteria and here's the place where you go do your laundry and everything is already decided, including sometimes like the furniture inside the houses. And so people, you know, they look at the kind of Mies van der
mm.
Rohe or the Oscar Niemeyer and they say, wow, this is kind of an interesting apartment, but these giant straight back chairs or whatever, these strange concrete ledges, they're incredibly uncomfortable. And I would like to decide to have like plush cushions in my house because I personally want to like take a nap.
I didn't realize that in Brasilia they actually plan the inside of the apartments as well. That is, yeah, that is it. That's taking it to a new level.
That's actually I'm not sure about that, but that's a kind of high modernism in general where
Right.
they have
Okay.
like furniture with the, you know, don't the architect decides everything.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. That's what we want to avoid. So I want to finish by asking you a little bit about the pandemic because this is how you finished the book. Because I mean, you were writing this book during the pandemic, right? And it came out in 2022, and it's been a couple of years since then. We've nominally emerged out of the pandemic. At least people want to forget about it. And you say that it had complex effects on the debate at the time you were writing. So, on the one hand, there was the direct fear of the coronavirus and its interaction with density. The more people, the reasoning goes, the more likelihood you're going to contract the virus. You say that may not be true, given what we know about how diseases spread, but it was a real fear nonetheless. On the other hand, people kind of realized how important urban spaces are when they were trapped inside their house for 3 months during summer in 2020, especially. I mean, I remember that very, very vividly. I mean, how do you think this has developed? Do you think that this has had a lasting impact, or do you think that it's just kind of been forgotten? How do you think the pandemic has affected this debate?
I think thankfully it's not been as long lasting as I was afraid that it might be. You know, I was writing this book from Melbourne, which had the longest lockdown of any city in the world. And so I was,
Right.
you know, sitting in my apartment and sort of wondering, we had a curfew and it was a quite intense experience. Um, but I think that most people are kind of willing to, you know, put aside their germ phobia and ride public transportation, be in an apartment, be in a movie theater. It's not a kind of long-term problem. And if anything, I think that perhaps there's been some positive lessons about public health that people have internalized, where you see a lot more people now, you know, wearing a mask just on a general daily basis, like you would see in an Asian city, just to have like a you know, better health quality. Um, I don't think it's long-term fears. I think the one thing that it may have rearranged, which I didn't expect and perhaps could be even more profound, is the ability to work remotely. And so you've seen a long-term crisis in office spaces in a lot of major cities. You see a lot more people who are able to work from home. And increasingly, you also see people who are perhaps going to try to find other places to work and live that are cheaper because they can be completely remote. It's not everyone. A lot of people have jobs that are in person and are very tactile and they can't just be on Zoom all day long. But there are enough people that could really change some real estate economics, and it could be transnational as well. So, it is possible now to have a job in Toronto and live in Cancun and get your Toronto salary and spend it in Mexican pesos for a lot more bang for your buck. So that could be a big thing, and I don't know what that will look like on the social level, and I'm not
Mm.
sure it'll be a big enough change to affect housing markets. I suspect not. I think people are probably going to want to live in the same cities, the same big, expensive, successful ones. But it definitely will have a big effect on office space, which it already has. And you see some major rethinking of office space in major cities.
That's really interesting, yeah, because I don't think you really mentioned that in the book, did you? So that's kind of something that's emerged, the rise of remote work since the pandemic finished, air quotes. But yeah, I don't know. Is it going
No,
to have an
I should
impact?
say
Sorry.
San Francisco, they that was a place where during the pandemic, a lot of tech and people who were, had really good salaries said, I'm gonna, I'll move to Montana
Mm,
and rent or buy a house and stay there. And some people may have wanted to stay there, but most of the companies have said, yeah, you can't stay there permanently. You have to
right,
come back.
right.
And then some of the companies have
That's
also said, if you want to work somewhere else, we're renegotiating your salary because you're not making a Bay Area wage and living in Portugal.
yeah,
So yeah,
yeah, yeah. Companies won't like it. And I mean, I was
yeah,
kind of concerned about the social implications of what you said about moving to Cancun, but I just think, yeah, it's such a big move that some people might do it, but it seems like it's just not going to be like a phenomenon.
yeah. We'll see. I mean,
We'll
I'm
see.
I'm
Yeah,
curious if it is, but
yeah.
maybe it's temporary. Maybe it's just related to certain ages of people. But yeah, we'll see. So I think it's still coming to fruition now.
The final thing that you mentioned, which really caught my eye, because I've been obsessed by essential workers or key workers during the pandemic, because it was just this moment, and we've all forgotten about it. It really fucking infuriates me. We've all forgotten about it, but everyone was like, "Oh yeah, those are the people that actually do the stuff that matters," and everybody just knew who it was,
Yeah,
right? There's no, I mean,
yeah,
there was some, of course, there were some questions, there were some blurry lines, but yeah, farmers, people who deliver your food, people who work in like supermarkets, right? Doctors and nurses, obviously. They're all essential workers, and YouTubers are not, right? And it's just it was just incredible. Everybody just understood that instantly. Like, you didn't even, everybody just would have come to probably a list with like a 90% correlation between the categories of what counts as an essential worker. And now we've just forgotten about that. And in the UK, our doctors and nurses and teachers and, well, everyone else, have faced pay stagnation at best. And you suggest something which I thought was a simple idea, but great. You said all essential workers should be guaranteed housing in cities, or wherever
yeah.
they work. Sorry.
Or maybe even build them housing. Maybe
Yeah.
have like, here's the hospital and the public funds as well as like if it's the hospital, they construct the housing
Mm.
and you get to have the housing, in a kind of place that's nearby enough for transportation to get to the hospital.
Yeah.
And you really value those people. I mean, I think that there's a real level of people being completely infuriated who are working for the NHS as nurses and doctors and who lived quite far away and had to come by all these kind of houses where people were working from home and not doing much, and they were still taking their massive commute. Some places they changed that. Some people in Australia who are doctors and nurses were living in hotels,
Right.
not just because they didn't want to spread COVID because they were working in the emergency room, but because also they lived so far away. It was like, let's get you here, closer to your place of work. And what if that was permanent?
They also put unhoused people in hotels in the UK. I don't know if they did that in
Yeah,
Australia too, which
huge
was
thing in Australia.
equally, I mean, good at the time, but equally infuriating because you're like, wait a minute, what? So you can just give them the spare hotel rooms? Why
Yeah,
are you
it's like,
doing
oh
that
well, we
before?
actually can solve this
Yeah,
problem. Whoa, look at
it's
that.
just,
Yeah.
yeah. So I mean, police in the UK they get free transport. Sorry, I think the Met, at least in London, they get free use of the tube and I think buses. So I think, yeah, like those exactly what you said, like housing complexes, special purpose built public housing, and free transport, and I don't know, maybe there are some other things that we could think of, but providing that to essential workers to me seems to be like the way to actually honor them, not just clapping, but
Yeah.
like actually permanently recognize the contribution they make.
Yeah, and if not, you're going to get a really pissed off constituency of important people who make society function. There's so many places like in, teachers, nurses, cops who just can't live in an entire city and live in the surrounding city. And they feel totally excluded. Like, what's
Mm.
it like to be in a place like Boulder and provide an essential service? And none of those people actually live in Boulder. Ditto with Manhattan,
Yeah,
ditto with a lot of places.
yeah,
And so you're living in a place, you have what's it called on this city's name on your uniform, but you live in a different city.
yeah,
So it's like on one hand, I provide an essential service. On the other hand, this city can't stand me. They don't want me to be a part of their community,
yeah,
even though I'm supposedly essential.
yeah.
So I think that
Yeah.
you got to solve the problem because there's people who I think will continue to feel really indignant about that.
Yeah, yeah, I absolutely agree. And it's not just public ish workers, right? There was a statistic from the American Trucking Association when they said 94% of truckers quit per year. So only
Yeah.
6% stay per year. And it just boggles the mind. And they're like, yeah, we're running out of truckers. And it's like, yeah, no wonder. No wonder, because they truckers are essential as well, right? They're in the private sector, but they're essential, and they're just treated so poorly. But I mean, it all goes back to this. I think, to try and round it off with a neat little bow, it's like we've been getting at this broader social question, right? The foundation, the social foundation of the economy, and the role housing plays in that, and trying to shore this up instead of relying on housing, private housing, and having it as a pension as well. Just building a society that actually isn't so dependent on private ownership of housing. And what, YIMBYism is absolutely welcome, but I mean, I think, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think that in practice, again, its principles are broad, but in practice, it's like maybe been a limitation of the YIMBY debate, and we can move past it by calling for these broader social gains.
Yeah. That sounds about right to me. I think that's a good way to think about it. I think that they did really important work for laying a foundation for that.
Yeah,
But moving forward, it's probably one of the best options.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, so thanks so much for joining me from Melbourne, Max. I really enjoyed this talk.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Right, see you later. Yo, yo, yo! I'm still here. I'm still here. Don't know why I did that. I don't know why I did that, guys. I didn't sleep last night. Um, and I thought I performed quite well as an interviewer, despite that my lack of sleep. Can't turn the camera on because OBS doesn't work properly. Which screen do I put it on? The starting soon screen. We'll go back to the starting soon screen. We'll loop it just like I seamlessly, successfully looped the conversation just then. Okay, hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for joining, everybody. And I'll see you on Friday, because I've got another one on Friday with someone who I'm very excited to talk to, who's actually a colleague of mine. And amazingly, for once, she isn't a white male. I've managed to get someone who isn't a white male to speak to me. It's amazing. All right, see you all